much of the reason people are interested in issues is because those issues are terrain in a battle that exists, right? The analogy I sometimes think of is people get into sports usually first through rooting for a team and then through learning about the sport, becoming interested in the sport because they care about one side winning in a war. It's a rarer person who first gets interested in baseball neutral to who wins and then only later begins rooting for a particular team, right? So much of the reason people want to become educated about any particular issue is because it's already terrain in the culture war that they can fight for, right? People first look for the fight and then want to get informed in the context of the fight, which is totally natural. I'm not claiming to be exempt from this. You know, this is something I experience in my own psychology and I see in society in general and other people. And so it's easy for me to be pessimistic about the possibility of finding a tech-based solution to a problem that seems inherent in our psychology. Can you talk me out of that pessimism?
So the question you bring up is a kind of realpolitik critique or question of, is human nature inexorably the thing we're up against? So if you read Machiavelli, reread the 48 Laws of Power, or anything that is kind of doing a realpolitik assessment of patterns of human behavior historically, the argument can be made that humans are intrinsically, and maybe there's a Gaussian distribution based on their genetics or their whatever it is, something of how much of this, but that the distribution as a whole, humans are either innately too irrational or too rivalrous, or both, to be able to have something like adequate sense making and adequate integrative values to be able to have an emergent order and culture beyond an in-group that is unified against an out-group, right? That would be the question that we are kind of bound to. If there isn't a big enough out-group, we will never be able to get the binding energy. We will go tribal on each other. And this is one of the arguments about one of the things that happened in the US. Obviously, the US has had rivalry for a long time. The Civil War was a good example. There have been plenty of examples across partisanship or class or race or region. But we can also see that there was a kind of patriotism and reunification associated with World War II and for a little while afterwards. And when we look at the intensity of partisanship in the US today, where even when I was a kid, the senators on the floor that would be arguing with each other would go out to lunch together afterwards, and that doesn't happen. It's like what happened in that time period. Part of it has to do with the social media thing. Part of it has to do with things that occurred in broadcast media. There's a number of things. One of the arguments that many people brought up is that it intensified after the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall came down. In the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War created a binding energy for the US to all be on the same side adequately against a threatening enough external enemy. And that when it came down, and China didn't look anything like it does today, and they didn't have, and Russia didn't even have Putin yet organizing them in a more strategic way, there wasn't a big enough enemy to unify the US against itself. The US was the number one biggest force and the number three biggest force that the left and right turned against each other as the kind of largest source of energy to extract or predatory advantage to incur. And then that has continued as China has moved into a total different position. And that's occurring in other parts of the world. So there's this question of, can people be unified at a scale much larger than tribal without an external enemy? Or is that innate to us? And we can see Jane Goodall's and Jimmy Carter's and Martin Luther King's and Carl Sagan's and people that seem to have a more universal ethic. And there's a question of, is that conditionable across a population widely? or those people naturally outliers for some reason will always be outliers, and that trying to think about conditioning qualities like that more widely is folly. Eric Weinstein and I had a conversation a couple years ago on his podcast, and this was like the heart of the thing that we talked about, because he and I had a fairly similar assessment of the catastrophic risk landscape that exponential tech under current kinds of rivalrous and irrational governance creates. And we each had a thought on how to overcome that. And they were different. And he made a joke that was fun. Was he's like, well, I think your solution requires changing human nature, but I'll indulge you on that because mine requires breaking the speed of light. And his solution was, no, I think we are too rivalrous. We have to be able to have civilizations work that have some intrinsically shared value base. If they're too close to someone else that doesn't have enough shared value base, they won't care. And if they will end up wanting the other one's resource at a certain point. So we need to be able to inhabit planets that are far enough apart that war is unfeasible. And like, you can see how someone smart thinking well about these things could be like, well, maybe that's the case, right? Maybe that is actually a necessary thing. And I don't know if my sense of it is will end up being right, because obviously we don't have the basis to be able to say that with much certainty, but I'll tell you why I think it is. One of the postmodern critiques of modernity that was right is that the idea that there is an unbiased, objective assessment of the world is dangerous. That when we're doing, because in a complex situation, which things I pick to measure, even if I'm measuring and repeating measurement and getting it right and not messing that up anywhere, just by cherry picking out of the data of a very large set, or even cherry picking what I do the science to measure on, I can get something that is quote unquote true, but not representative, and then argue as if it's representative, or decontextualize the facts, or Lakoff frame the interpretation that there's a pragmatics in addition to the kind of semantics. And that we can see this more in the social sciences, where there's increased complexity with the whole early social science in the US of why blacks were a genetically lower race than the US, and thus the Declaration of Independence didn't pertain to them, and yet we weren't morally corrupt. Or the science of phrenology or things like that. You'd be like, yeah, that was just political vested interest gibberish, guising itself in something that sounded sciencey, and it's not anything like real objective science. Well, I think the answer isn't you throw out science and say that there is no way to come to truth, because if that's the case, all there is power, and then we're actually stuck in that thing. We need to just correct for it. So we don't say that anyone can be unbiased, but we say we can seek bias correction. We can seek to be able to take all of the perspectives well, not just performatively, but really seek to inhabit them, and then seek to identify where there's true signal and seek to synthesize them. And so is it possible to do bias correction better towards shared sense making that never has 100% confidence, but an increasingly well epistemically grounded confidence? So the reason I say this is because a lot of the social science that we have, I think, is problematic in this way. I think it's after the thing called empire, and then even the thing called industrial revolution and capitalism had taken over, which was not the evolutionary history of humans in mostly tribal environments. And it created a source of conditioning, but it was fairly ubiquitous conditioning. And since it was ubiquitous, we just said, oh, this is human nature. And then where we would see something like an indigenous tribe that was different, it could be thrown out as a statistical outlier.